Welcome to Down to Earth Radio. Before we begin, a few questions. Is the climate changing? Can we do anything about it? Does choosing to travel the public transport or fighting to save a local patch of forest really matter? According to Professor Mike Hulme, it does. The author of Why We Disagree About Climate Change, Understanding Controversy, Inaction, and Opportunity, believes that rather than waiting for global agreements, more progress will be made through local and sector-specific actions and solutions. And this essentially is a political than a scientific process. Kaushik Das Gupta gets you more.
You've spoken about climate change, that climate change has become the mother of all issues over the last few decades. Can you explain what is it that has led to this?
But human-induced climate change has been studied by scientists for about 30 or 40 years. But it was in the 1980s the idea of anthropogenic climate change as a political issue, an important political issue, both domestically and internationally, first came to the foreground. And in 1992, the United Nations signed an agreement called a Convention on Climate Change, which was seeking ways to reduce climate warming that would be caused by human activities. And so what we've seen in the 17 years since then is that more and more countries, more and more businesses, more and more social movements have come to see that actually climate change is something that affects the way in which they conduct their business or the way in which it will affect the goals that they have as an organization. So more and more organizations now actually think that climate change matters.
You speak about the plurality of views on climate change. The unstated assumption is there's a parity of all views. It tends to mean that the one who created the problem, that person's view has the same currency as the person who might be a victim of.
Yes, I do emphasize the need to allow different voices to be heard around climate change. Now, of course, some voices will always be louder than others. National governments tend to have a very loud voice, as do some of the multinational corporations. In my country, in England, some of the loudest voices that we hear about climate change are actually from the media or from environmental organizations. But part of what I'm arguing for is that we need to widen the number of voices that we hear and to recognize why some voices are very loud. For example, people who argue for a new carbon market to be introduced, it's putting a price on carbon and using the mechanisms of the market to trade carbon. Why are those voices in the business community or in government, why are they very loud? Whereas perhaps the voices of local communities, maybe particularly in parts of the south, are heard much less frequently.
What do we need to do to widen the number of voices?
Well, I think part of it is education. We need to make sure that environmental education is embedded into our schools curriculum. We actually would do very well, I think, to insist that all higher education students at least had some introduction to ideas of environmental sustainability or sustainable development, the idea that there is a relationship between the environment, the economy, and society. The other, I think, is to realize that different voices are quite legitimate, even though we might disagree. The thing is that the science of climate change is reasonably clear that human emissions of greenhouse gases are altering the global climate. But just because there is a consensus about the science of climate change doesn't mean there has to be a consensus about the politics or about the responses. So part of my argument, again, is to make it legitimate for us to disagree about climate change and to understand the reasons why we disagree.
You also say that science has done its bit. Now it's time for politics to take over.
Yes, I say that science can only take us so far towards finding solutions. If we think that science about climate change can tell us what we should do, or even if we think that science dictates certain types of policy options, then I think we've misunderstood the role of science. That is the role of politics. It's not for scientists to tell the Prime Minister what to do. It is for the role of civil society to have deliberation and debate and argument and discussion about what India should do, about what England should do, and ultimately around what the nations and the world should do. That is a political process. It's not a scientific one.